Welcome to the Redacted Culture Cast for Friday, February 10th of 2023. I want to begin today with a small announcement. Actually, it's not going to be so small. We are releasing, and we are in the works of releasing a skateboard deck, which, if you're on YouTube, is on the screen now. And that skateboard deck is going to be the proceeds of that are going towards the Firearms Policy Coalition to deal with and address the problem of the brace ruling. Now, and as it stands right now, we're looking at about a week and a half to 2 weeks out. We're finalizing the details to make sure everything's ready to go, but be ready for that. This will be a pre-order format. We'll take the pre-orders and then we will deliver them as soon as they arrive to us. So that is the business being handled. Otherwise, your support, we are thankful for your support that you can do through redactedllc.com. That is where our merch is. We've got some small IR identifier patches, some made by Moral Decay Patchworks put together a set for us, and so they're on there. And then stay tuned for what's to come, because season 1 operation 2 is just starting to creep out. So if you've purchased something from us before, we have your mailbox, and we will be sending you a postcard to start the experience of an operation. That being said, today's subject is, in one way, a bit of a eureka moment of understanding what it is, or trying to understand what it is about gun culture, veteran experiences, and the distinctions between virtues or values, and experiences and knowledge that we would want to, or that we admire in certain people and we want to see across the table. In some ways, I'm going to go back to this full screen of myself. In some ways, it's interesting looking at how culture has, especially gun culture, has drawn a distinction in the past between people of different experiences, and then tried to make evaluations of it, and then how those distinctions have become less relevant. But today, I'd title it On Mindset, Character, and Military Experience. And part of the eureka moment that drew it out was the conversation that was recently had between Mike Jones, also known as Grand Thumb, and Christian Craighead, who has been referred to as Nairobi Actual in the past. Now, that being said, that's where it was inspired by. We'll see that as we've gone through. I have had to write this one down because when it comes to philosophy, sometimes you can produce things through speech, and sometimes you just have to write them down. And that is one of the values, or something that we get out of writing it down, is the ability to look at it, work, and make corrections. So that, without being said, on mindset, character, and military experience, also known as being versus doing. Two phenomena. First, that boys will desire to be soldiers, destined to go to war. And second, that a culture or subsection of a culture would venerate or vilify a soldier merely for their profession, inquires the question of why, or maybe even how. Were it so simple if were it so simply reduced to the context of the situation, all of human history and conflict would be reduced, flattened of sorts, to the vaguely acceptable dehumanization of all by the descript dehumanization of a few. Mystics of propaganda, those who view the world in a three-way metaphysical division of peoples, who see people divided into the preachers, the plebs, and the enlightened, will claim with the same arrogance of a mocker that war is only the product of the powerful at the expense of the powerless. They betray what they believe about humanity. They betray what they believe about a humanity, exposing it to the world by disguise, while they attempt to disguise their own contempt for mankind behind a smokescreen distraction of forcing their audience to either identify with the oppressor or the oppressed, the oppressor or the fool. In their worldview, all peoples are either the manipulators or the manipulated, with themselves being the only exception, but that must be left unstated. This artificially builds themselves upon a moral pedestal shrouded in smoke, the fog of war of such, which, if cleared, one would see it only to be a false platform built on corpses and malice. That men go to war solely because they believe the propagandists lie skips the crucial element. Even if true, what is it about propaganda that is so effective? By identifying this, we can understand what the false enlightened believes about mankind. Whether or not an individual volunteers to go to war based on a true cause or a lie does not sufficiently explain, but rather assumes and attempts to argue a point through this assumption what it is that men seek in war. This is even more elaborated by the diminishing distinction in gun culture between the veteran and the citizen. As the cultural pedestal separating the Spec Ops vet from his fellow American diminishes, a window into the virtues, values, and worldviews of what we aspire to comes into view as we desire that truth to be apparent across society. First, we must return to the example of the propagandist's argument. And what I mean by the propagandist or the mystic of propaganda is that very specific type of person who says things with some form of conviction that it's all propaganda, it's all lies, all war is a racket. It is simply the evil manipulators manipulating the fools into being or going to war for a cause they're not in their favor. So we must break down that argument, though. We must break down that statement because what it is it's making an argument about what war is. But that is the overt part of it. What it is subtly implying, or actually probably arguing more specifically, is what it is about people. What is true about people and what they value. So the statement, men only go to war because of propaganda, is not only an assumption that there is of how propaganda might function or even its definition, but it's also a it's a statement, a metaphysic statement about what it is that people are. Are they a mind and a will, or are they just a motivated? Are they only motivated by self-interest? Or it also makes an assumption about perhaps what it means to be manipulated. So, men only go to war because of propaganda is the statement, or all war is a racket. It is all war is a racket by the powerful at the expense of the powerless. Explanation. Propaganda makes a false claim or it lies in order to convince people to go to war. That's the explanation within the statement. And the definition is that propaganda is a lie. An effective lie requires truth to be effective. It's not a circular sentence. It's just thorough. It's kind of annoying. So point one, men go to war because of propaganda. That's the statement. Two, the explanation. Propaganda makes false claims or lies in order to convince men or trick them to go to war. Three, propaganda is a lie. Four, an effective lie requires truth to be effective. Five, propaganda lies about a situation or a circumstance in order to motivate individuals, men, to act out their values in a way that is desired by the propagandist. The manipulator cannot manipulate the manipulated. A person cannot manipulate his target if he is not willing to engage with the motives of that person. So, another way of saying this, seven, final. The propaganda, if assumed, reveals more about the speaker and the fooled than the environment at all. So it takes something that looks like it can be observed, all war is a racket, but what it's really arguing is it's arguing about human nature. So, how is this relevant? The argument of the propagandist and the idea of the propaganda argument is something that is used to draw out the difference between the context and circumstances of an individual and the values that they hold. Propaganda would be ineffective if it lied about the context in a way which would motivate the fooled or the manipulated to work in a way counterproductive to the propagandist's aim. The manipulation is only effective if they can take something valued by the manipulated and twist that or lie about the context to take that person to move of their own will. This is why we separate manipulation from coercion or the use of force. But what it's functionally doing is it's functionally trying to lie about the context in order to harness the motivation, the motive power of an individual's values to function in the way desired by the propagandist. What this what this must rely on is a firm understanding of the values of the people we describe. Our values inform us of how we should act out once given context, either through the thought experiment. We can observe this either through a thought experiment or through observation. So the same though goes for heroes. We've made this distinction. I'm going to take a break here. We've made a distinction between what we're using propaganda. We've made a distinction between the context of a situation that a quote unquote propagandist would use, not a mystic of propaganda. That's somebody who believes that propaganda serves as a monomania explanation to all things, or all things challenging their worldview. But rather, we're talking about the person who uses propaganda, because we know it exists. The person using propaganda can lie about the context in order to motivate the target, the manipulated, to act out what he believes is their values in a way that is desired by the manipulator. So the manipulator lies to get somebody to act of their own will to do something that the manipulator wants. But he has to understand, he has to know or believe that he knows what it is that motivates the manipulated. Motive, one thing. So context, motive, values. Values being what they hold as value. This then is the negative view of it. Now there's a way that we can flip it over. We can take these same three things and we can flip it on its head and we can look at something else and use that distinction to our advantage, especially in gun culture. The same goes for heroes. We call or venerate heroes. We call people heroes or venerate them for demonstrating through action an exemplary display of a quality we value. Our heroes do the things in accordance to our values, often in extraordinary proportion or circumstance. So, in a sense, this may get simplified. A soldier acts in a heroic circumstance that a citizen may not be in when he exhibits courage in a firefight. It isn't him being a soldier, nor being in a firefight, but the act of courage that we admire. By having a fighting profession, by choice or by draft, let's say, um, by having a fighting profession, whether it is by choice or by draft, he may have a greater number of opportunities or a greater likelihood he may have a greater number of opportunities to exhibit that quality or virtue, but it does not guarantee that he has it. Ugh, sorry, hair's getting in the way. So, it is not being a soldier that makes him courageous. It is not being present in a gunfight which produces courage, but serves as an environment where the display of courage is clear. If he does not have it, it will not manifest. So, courage comes from the individual, but can be better seen in the context of environments, which are, as we understand it, more likely to be experienced by people whose profession it is to go to war. That does not change the value that we have, and it doesn't change whether or not the person has it. It is not being a soldier which causes one to be courageous. It is not causal. The act of becoming a profession is not causal in becoming a thing. However, that environment may be one where an individual cannot persist without that value or without that virtue or without that quality. So, a person It is not being a soldier which makes one courageous. However, being a soldier, we're going to get into this explanation. However, the environment that he will exist in may be one where he cannot persist without it, or it may be a concentration of people who value and exhibit said virtue, say mentorship or a school. Or it may be an environment where one is able to clearly demonstrate that said virtue, which is the visibility argument. It is not a place that causes said virtues, except for through education, perhaps, but it is a place where it is visible. A concentration of people with a trait can identify multiple things, but it does not impart that trait onto its people. For example, a team of rangers are not brave because they are rangers. A team of brave men are also not necessarily rangers. It is the case that most teams of rangers are brave. However, we are dependent on rangers acting bravely. Therefore, it is imperative to make sure all ranger teams are brave, replacing cowards with brave men. This would be like a form of an argument. This is getting closer to a formal form of logic and distinguishing things out. But a team of rangers are not brave because they are rangers. It is not being rangers that makes them brave. It is the case, however, that most teams of rangers are brave. I'm using rangers and braves as brave as placeholders for this argument. Therefore, it is imperative to make sure all ranger teams are brave, replacing cowards with brave men. And this is where we could come to the safe assumption that if a person is part of a ranger team, he could be considered brave. Given, if you know who I am, I have spent time in the ranger battalion, so you would say, is he self-aggrandizing? Thanks. Um, another example of this argument, or another form of an argument, another way of an argument involving the concept of bravery as a virtue and ranger teams as a subject, would be: bravery is a virtue we admire that can typically be found in ranger teams, but bravery is not exclusive to ranger teams. Bravery is a virtue we admire in ranger teams as well as in citizens. A person who was once in a ranger team could have once been brave or acted brave, but are they still? This is where that question comes to bear. And now we replace the word brave with any other virtue that we see, and perhaps any other virtue that we see in concentration in certain areas or certain employments or certain positions, because we want to, we see an environment like a special operations or a military or a SWAT team or whatever as an environment that we want it to cultivate certain virtues, or at least not allow those lacking said virtues to persist. And this though betrays us as in like a true betrayal, like a movie betrayal. It becomes a problem when we break down this distinction between the virtue and the team, when it becomes literally synonymous. It's a description, but it's not synonymous with. Bravery is not synonymous with being a ranger, but we want all rangers to be brave or something like that. So, one advantage that the veteran has over to the citizens in our day, in our modern gun culture, is the greater body of context, whether it's peers, deployments, awards by which to infer virtues such as bravery, but it does not infer that they bear that trait alone. Military experience is not equivalent to having said virtues. Citizens can be brave because they are people. Veterans can be brave because they are people. It is not being a citizen nor being a veteran which produces courage. So we have, category, human, subcategory, citizen, neighbor, friend, um, ranger, marine, whatever, veteran. And all of these people can have um, can exhibit the trait because it's the trait that we value, but that trait is valued because it is valued universally across people who bear it. And this is where human virtues would then contextually be universal in this. Well, not contextually be universal. The context of one situation does pertain to whether or not said actions are considered brave or tactical or skilled or whatever. It is these environments where we have more opportunity to reflect upon it. This is kind of where you get this is and the reason and where all this is coming from is perhaps a long series of too much thought spent on um quips and phrases like those who can't do teach, or um if you could do some if you knew so much about something, why wouldn't you go do it? And or if you're going to do all the work to train on something, why wouldn't you just go join the military? And there's so many answers to that question, but it's kind of an older question that doesn't it's no longer as germane to our day. But rather, the eureka moment in this where this came together was therefore, in all of this explanation, we have come to the conclusion that it is a virtue that we value in people, and that by seeing it displayed in people who have had certain jobs, we have an overt opportunity to see that quality and be praised. Let's just say praise that quality or claim that quality. But it is not the act of being the act of it is not merely the act of being a ranger that we would admire, but more so, or it's not the act of being a thing that we admire, we truly need to admire, we truly want to admire, but it is the bearing of virtues in said context. So when we talk about a virtue like courage, let's take the example of courage. Going back, we've talked about bravery, we've talked about courage, we've talked about these examples, not as what those definitions are, but the exhibition of those things dependent on one's position. Courage is such a thing where we are acting right now. Courage is a virtue that we value, and we are not always afforded with the we're not always afforded with the simplicity of context that the simple context that shouts out what it should be. But that does not give us opportunity not to be brave. Therefore, gun culture must focus on virtues and the expanse of said virtues, identify it in those who bear it, and punish those who fake it, regardless of background. Regardless of background. So, the question and the question as I'm kind of wrapping up the written portion, does gun culture understand its values? Is this the goal of ethics? Does it admire it in people who do not exhibit said virtues because of their position? Do we give somebody credit for virtue not displayed because of their job title? Or do we give virtue undisplayed by people because of what their job title isn't, or their status is or isn't? So, how do we treat and the final question would be, how do we treat the unproven? What I mean by unproven is you have this challenge of a person by all intents and purposes appears to be able to present or a person is presenting the virtues, but they have not encountered said scenario which would have permitted the exhibition of said virtues. The exhibition is not the word I'm looking. If How do we deal with that as a gun culture? Because for many of us, we actually do live in a time of relative peace. When I say I mean relative peace. Like, come on, guy. It's not. There are threats. There are threats on our doorstep at every creaking moment, but They are very far from the overt style of barbarians at the gates or zombies in the streets that make life so simple. That don't just wait until I get to in the future when I get to talk about my theory on zombies, um, and why they were trendy for so long. And the short answer would be because it's the closest way to justify hating my neighbor by saying he's a zombie or something like that. But we'll get onto that later. So, how do we treat the proven, and how do we treat the unproven, and how do we define and distinguish between the two, and how do we these are questions that are important for gun culture to consider, and we may not actually come to consensus on it. We may not actually conclude the whole thing together, but it is an individual's responsibility and focus to spend time on this subject. And so, in closing, why and how this thing came together this argument and this idea came together was that there was a conversation that I think is still on YouTube, unless somebody has decided to take it down. That was on the Grand Thumb channel with Christian Craighead, who is occasionally referred to as like Nairobi Actual, and he and Christian made a really, really good statement in that. I would say in the latter half of that show, the two of them had a conversation that I am in a sense jealous for. I'm really thankful that they were to have it, and that it was recorded. But that show had where in that conversation, Christian Craighead made a statement about um, practice, skill, like about mindset. I'm sorry. He made a statement about mindset that that sort of summarized a series of frustrations and thoughts that I had building over time. And he summarized it so well that I'm thankful that it was public. And what he said, without spoiling it, because not I'm gonna spoil it as best as I can because I have to get the idea out. And if you want to go over there and listen to it, please do, because I think it's on YouTube. But what he basically said was, the reason why you do things, the mindset behind practice, like fitness, like skill in using your equipment, and the mindset that you have to have when carrying a firearm and deciding to carry a firearm, is that you may use it for its end purpose, which is to cause death and harm. In other words, you may have to use it to be violent, but you have to have resolved the ethical problems with the ethical framework by which you would do something before you actually, if you're going to actually carry it. And I'm kind of butchering his thought, but I am trying to put it together. And he made this argument. He said, regardless of who you are, if you're going to carry the firearm and you don't have the if you and you're not willing to use it, then you are a liability. And he's because and if you're going to carry a firearm and you're not going to learn how to use it, you are also a liability to not only yourself but to those around you, because you will be incapable of addressing the circumstance when it comes, because you are so uncomfortable with the use of that firearm that your focus will be entirely on the tool of your possession, and not on what you're supposed to be doing. You train so that you free up mental space to more accurately and quickly assess the situation at hand. If you are pulled from the situation that you're in because of self-consciousness with a tool that you have not practiced with sufficiently, whether it's a plate carrier, night vision, or an EDC handgun, you will become a liability and you will become a problem. Whether it's because you will become a liability, or you will become a problem because you will either be incapable of addressing the situation at hand, or you'll make it worse. Gives a series of examples from it. And that made me realize, and that was helpful for me to kind of draw along this understanding of what it is about job titles, status, values, and our culture that we look at. What is it that we should value is one question. What is it that we appear to be valuing is another question, or another thing. And then the third one is, what is it? What does it look like, and what should we consider our values? Because as gun culture goes forward, and I think, and next week on Monday, the conversation with Fred, also known as Counting Coup, is going live on Monday. There's a part of that conversation that's really good where he talks about he brings up something germane to the subject, but he talks about um, what a long-term goal for gun culture should be. And it has to do with what we think about its values. And I'm thankful for his time with us. So when we look at gun culture, whether the person holds a title or doesn't hold a title, there are values that we want to see in them. We want to see things, we want to see character traits and values in them. And those are the things that every man can pursue. Every man can pursue diligence. Every man can pursue courage. Every man can pursue skill and wisdom. it is not necessarily holding a job title that imparts that position, though we can conclude that people with certain job titles tend to exhibit certain things. It is not the act of being a thing that equivocates. It is not the act of being a thing or having a job title which produces in oneself said character. And as we go forward, this is the great equalizer in gun culture, is character. It's character. It comes down to what are the character qualities that you're building in yourself and your community and your neighborhood and your family and your children and your gang of 6 or your club of 4 or the people you go shoot competition with. It isn't always overt. It isn't really always overt, but it does have a relevancy there, is that there are things that we value and we admire in people. Sometimes it gets caught up in titles and positions, but sometimes it gets caught up in fame or achievements. And the thing that we ultimately come down to is that there are qualities in people that we value. So yes, and the qualities are not distinguished by titles. And so instead of saying that we're all equal because we all have titles, we're all equal because titles doesn't make the man. Rather, it's this is the best ground. This is the best grounds for interaction in that sense. Um, it is probably the most foundational thing that we have to unify on is a combination of is values and that's what that's going to be. So I'm going to bring this up on the screen again for those who are watching on YouTube or on Rumble. We are working on a shirt and a skateboard deck. We've talked to the folks who are going to make it, and it looks like it's going to be greenlit. But we're looking at about well, we technically made the announcement last week, so we're looking at the earliest Friday, but we're going to be looking at a week and a half time. We'll be opening this up for a 7-day pre-order. It is conjunction with Orion Training Group, and it is a skateboard, a white base skateboard, just the board that says human privacy is not your property. In a classic redacted fashion, there are things to be figured out within it, but it is in conjunction with Orion Training Group, and that will be going live for pre-order. The proceeds of which, our costs will be covered, but the proceeds of which will be going to the Firearms Policy Coalition to give them a slightly larger war chest, as it is said, to combat and present challenges to the ATF's brace ruling, which makes felons of us all. So good on that. Other than that, I will see you around. Thank you for your support. Thank you for sharing the show. I appreciate it when you share it. When you've left some reviews for us on Spotify, at least I've seen those. I think we've seen them on Apple as well. But thank you for your reviews. Thank you for your comments on YouTube. Go ahead and leave a comment down below, and I'll try to get to those back to those quickly. And if you're trolling, I will ignore you. But fine, we'll figure that out. But I look forward to hearing from you soon. And thank you for this conversation. Thank you for being a part of the conversation as well. And we look forward to seeing you soon. So this has been the Redacted Culture Cast. We'll talk to you later.